Yeah, and I'm probably going to have Josh kind of help me with the lights, especially the one that's over the screen. And in doing the 5-year financial forecast, I typically do it all at once. And I said there's so many things that are changing. There's so many things that are different. There are so many things that have happened just in the last 3 years. And what happens is there's this accumulation of information. And some of it, as we accumulate information, we get a little smarter or a little wiser. One of the things that I think is interesting is that I did my first 5-year forecast in July of 2003 here as we were working on the budget. And starting in 2005, I started saying KPERS and KPNF is underfunded. And that was in the good times, folks. And I kept saying, if somebody doesn't address it in terms of how to fund it in the long term, if there are changes in economic conditions, or if there's a downturn in the stock market, that funding liability increases and becomes more difficult as you go forward. 2006, I started saying, and here's another thing you need to remember, the state of Kansas requires us, if we have employees that are in KPERS and KPNF, if they retire from the city, to maintain them on our health insurance plan. And all of a sudden, understand they're creating a liability for the city. And while it's nice that we provide that, understand that that becomes a requirement that you have to fund. The first time that we did a OPUB and its other pension and benefits calculations, I want to say it was 08, 09. But if you go back and you look at 09's audit, you'll see that our OPEB actuarial obligation is $500,000. It's a number that was never in our financial statements until really accounting principles started catching up with the problem that has been building really for 10 or 15 years. And so I listened to this discussion of these pension obligations, and I listened to the blame that has been, in a sense, portrayed that it's the unions that caused it, and the truth is the unions didn't cause it. The deficit that Wisconsin has is not a whole lot different than the structural deficit that Kansas has, but Kansas is a right-to-work state, so I don't see that there's really the union that caused this. What caused it, and you'll see it in one of the clips that I'm going to run, because I have like 4 clips that I want to show you, is that those obligations were out there. Those unfunded liabilities were known, and there were decisions made not to fund them. And to think that all of a sudden this is just a problem that just occurred, it's a problem that's been there 14 to 20 years. One of the simple ways to have cured that in the Kansas system would have been simply to increase the contribution that employees made to the system. That would have been a fairly simple thing to do. In part, that became difficult because of the size of the number of employees that are in counties, cities, school districts throughout Kansas. It is the largest employer in Kansas, those 3 groups. If you put them together, those public sector employees are the largest employers in Kansas. So what happens is there was never a political will to have the employees pay more, and there really needed to have been more political will. This is not a problem that couldn't have been solved a long time ago, and the problem is we've waited until it's a crisis. Now, I will tell you that some of the information, since it's based on 09 numbers, is incorrect because 010 happened to be one of the biggest run-ups in the stock market over the last 50 years. It's a run-up because if you go back and look at what happened in 08 and 09, everybody's portfolios got hammered, but 010 actually improved. So the condition of some of these pension systems are much better. I'm going to run maybe 3 or 4 minutes of sort of the meltdown of housing so that you get a sense for what has happened and what is still to come. Because I think what happens is we make the assumption that all the bad mortgages have gone through the system, and the truth is 1 trillion of the bad mortgages have run through the system. There's another 1.5 trillion to come. And it really doesn't take into account some of the leveraging that commercial property owners did throughout the United States. We have very conservative bankers in the Kansas City metropolitan area, If you look at any of the bank rankings over the last 3 years, Commerce Bank and UMB, in terms of security, in terms of their performance, are 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 over the last 3 years of all the banks in the United States. So that very conservative lending habit that we have with our 2 major banks in the Kansas City region, as well as CapFed here in Johnson County, has really allowed us to weather this storm much better. We still have problems, and some of our problems are tied to other issues in other parts of the country in terms of how they're impacting housing values. And there's numbers that I'm going to give you. It's not necessary to write them down. What I want to try to do is to give you what I'm calling the mega trends in local government. The things that we're going to have to deal with, things that we need to understand as we start working on our forecast and as we start working on future budgets. These things are not going to change. They are always going to be here, and those cities, counties, school districts, states that can identify these trends and figure out how you live within your budgets, you shrink your budget down, what are the most important investments that you make. Smaller doesn't necessarily mean you don't invest more in certain areas and less in others. Smaller means that there is a smaller amount of money that's going to be available in the long term. If you remember last year, I also talked about recessions, that there's all kinds of recessions. There's V's, where you come out fairly quickly, 6 to 8 months. There's W's, which are double recessions. The thought that there could be a double recession is increasing daily, and I'm going to tell you why sort of at the end. There's an L, where you actually go into a recession and it hangs on a long time, and then it can become a depression. There was actually a period of time 2.5 years ago where we actually thought we were going to have deflation, where prices kept falling and falling and falling, and the concern was deflation is one of the things you really can't get out of easily. I will tell you that, and this isn't news, if you were at our council meeting in February, you know what we borrowed money for 5 years. It was 1.5% on average. Try as the Fed might in terms of basically keeping rates at zero, especially the short-term 91 T-bill rates. To keep the money supply up and interest rates low, we can't seem to create inflation. And there's a reason you need inflation, a modest amount of it, so that there is some economic activity. And so even with low interest rates, we're having a hard time generating economic activity. The first one that I'm going to share, I'm going to give you about 4 minutes of it, and it deals with sort of the mortgage market, and then I'll stop and sort of give you some statistics to remember, and then I'll pass out what our market values are. Paul Welcome visited with the mayor and I 2.5 weeks ago, and provided us with the assessed values for our community as well as the county. And then I'll kind of give you some county numbers, what our local numbers are.
When it comes to bailouts of American business, Barney Frank and the Congress may be just getting started. Nearly $2 trillion tax dollars have been shoveled into the hole that Wall Street dug, and people wonder, where's the bottom? It turns out the abyss is deeper than most people think, because there is a second mortgage shock heading for the economy. In the executive suites of Wall Street and Washington, you're beginning to hear alarm about a new wave of mortgages with strange names that are about to become all too familiar. If you thought subprimes were insanely reckless, wait till you hear what's coming.
This central part of California, Utah to some extent, anything outside of Detroit, Michigan, are the places that you'll find it that were hit the hardest as it relates to foreclosure. You'll also notice that it also overlaps unemployment. So as unemployment spikes in certain areas, you'll see the foreclosure rate going up because people are so highly leveraged. The statistic that came out today, and I think it was in the Star, if you went to maybe page 4, it was on a left-handed page, it was just a really small article, and it talked about the number of homes in the United States that were underwater. Underwater meaning they owe more than the home's worth. And if you looked at the statistic for the nation, it's at 23.1%, which is the highest ever in the history of the United States. 1 in 4 homes owe more than their home's worth. What led to a lot of the buildup in values throughout the last 20 years was the fact that you could buy a house and in time it would go up. In time could be as short as a year, it might have went up in value, but certainly in 5 years it would go up in value. And if you just sort of looked at, and I just pulled the Mission numbers for just total values in our community, and here's 1990 through 2010. We started at about 72 million in total assessed value, and in 2005 we had grown to almost 130 million. So in just that 15-year period, we had almost doubled the value of all property in the city of Mission. By 2010, as you can see, the trend is going in the opposite direction. If you looked at Johnson County total, 2006, 2007, about 0% growth, and then it was a negative 2.5% growth in 07, then it was negative 4.75% in 08, it was about 0 again in 09, and it's about 0 countywide again here in 010. These are the numbers that were provided by Paul Welcome for the city of Mission. Total appraised value in our community went up 1.5%. I will tell you that is an oddity in the United States. Property values aren't trending that way. Later on in that video, he talks a little bit about commercial values, how commercial values haven't really hit yet in terms of the hit. We saw some actually in the previous year. We thought our commercial values would be down quite a bit quite a bit more, and this is actually better than we thought in terms of commercial value. What's interesting is if you look at the percentages that agriculture, it's $390 worth versus $450. So you have this huge percent increase and you're going like, well, that's kind of strange. But it's not a lot of money. Probably the thing that's most important is I would tell you the total exempt. The growth that we had greatest in terms of property value is exempt property, which is property that doesn't pay property taxes to the city of Mission, and that grew almost 6%. Exempt property, those properties that don't pay taxes, represents almost 13% of total values within the city of Mission. As we get more senior living options are almost all going not-for-profit and exempting themselves from property taxes. So as those continue to build, they will not be on the tax rolls. The other problem that we have within the Northeast are large sections of property being taken over by KU Med Center or the biosciences area. All of those come off the tax rolls. So there's just large properties, especially up here, that are getting affected by it. If you looked at just the last 5 years and you just wanted to see what the trend was over the last 5 years, looks like that. So 06, we're still going up. 07, 08, we're starting, that's when it happened. 09, you're starting to see the impacts. 10. For the most part, we haven't seen the same volatility as other parts of the region or other parts of Johnson County. While we've had a decrease, and that decrease is substantial, it's not what you see in some areas. In part, we have a fairly stable housing base. We just got our first set of statistics for the census in 2010, and one of the troubling pieces in all of this, and I think we're all going to see the same thing, is that vacancies, and remember that the census was done in April of 2010. The vacancy rate, we've almost doubled the vacancy rate that we had in residential property. So if you go back to 2000, the vacancy rate was 4 to 4.5%. In 2010, it was almost 10% in terms of vacant residential property, which then is reflected in the fact that we have a smaller population, and it's almost totally a function of the fact that we have a higher vacancy rate than we did in 2000. So if you look at property tax values going out into the future, and understand that 11's not here, and if you remember his chart, 11's the next peak, which is what we're heading into right now. And if you realize that if that's the next peak, then the possibility or the probability that residential property in Johnson County is going to go up next year is null and void. If you listen to most of the prognosticators as it relates to values, and it's commercial or residential, most people say it will be 4 or 5 years until you see any meaningful increases in property values. What makes this really difficult is that the reason it's going to take 4 or 5 years, imagine that 1/4 of the people that own homes now in the United States can't sell their homes. So those are people that have been taken out of the market. They own more than their home's worth, so they can't sell it, because that would require them to put money in it, so they can't buy a new home. Then if you look at the demographics of the United States, and you start to take into account that 20 to 25% of us over the next 5 to 10 years will represent a portion of the population that's not going to move from their home, or they're moving to whatever their last home is. You end up with half the population that's eligible to purchase a home. Given that we have an oversupply of homes right now throughout the United States, there isn't really a new construction market that's out there. Maybe in apartments, maybe in senior living, but I don't think you're going to see home building like we saw between 1995 and 2006. And Will probably knows it better than anybody in this room, because I will tell you, Will probably saw it before anybody in this room realized it, because about 2006, housing permits in Johnson County went from an average of 3,500 to about 2,500. And over the last 3 years, it's been between 500 and 750. We're doing 1/7 in terms of new construction that we did 4 years ago. You take out that big, you lop off that much of your economy in terms of new construction, and there's no way property values go back up to those 2007, 2008 numbers until probably 2017, 2018. It's probably going to last even longer than we can anticipate. If I took consumption in terms of sales tax in Johnson County and I were to draw it on a board, it would look just like that chart there. You'd see a peak in 07, 08, and then you would see it fall off. And here's how it fell off. Total sales were about $11.5 billion in our economy in 2008, and now they're around $10 billion, meaning that there's been a reduction in sales in Johnson County of 15%. With that reduction in sales came a reduction in employees. The question is, did the reduction in employees cause a reduction in sales? My argument is they both compound each other. And I would also argue the fact that if we just say conservatively 1 in 15 homes in Johnson County, and that would be, it's more than that. Let's say it's 1 in 5. Instead of the national average of 25%, let's say it's 20%. Say 20% of the people are upside down on their mortgage. That means they can't get a home equity loan. And my guess is Will sees it with people that are trying to finance maybe their windows or improvements to their home. If you're upside down on your mortgage, you don't have a home equity line of credit. So if all of a sudden 1/4, 1/3 of your population doesn't have access to capital, they don't make home repairs. They don't purchase cars. And all of a sudden, there's just this shock that hits. It hits both the local, county, school, state, and federal budgets all at the same time. The state's budgets got masked in terms of the impacts. They should have saw what they're doing now a year ago, but the federal government, through ARRA and all the grant programs, hid it in terms of the problem that was going to exist within the states. And the next one, this is about 10 minutes, but it's a pretty good summary. The first video I showed you was from December of 2008. Most of the predictions that analyst made have been true in terms of when we would see the sweep back up, and it's occurring as we speak.
Mike, with the declination of new housing permits for new homes, is there any indication whatsoever that a percentage of people that would have been building homes are now trying to live within their means instead of outside it?
The people that were living beyond their means are usually in foreclosure right now, so we've actually seen rental rates at our apartments go up as a function of the foreclosure market. So you can rent apartments for more because people are having to find places to live. It's kind of a strange thing that happened.
Mike, you talked about vacancy rates. Do we have any idea of what the vacancy, how many houses we have in Mission? You said it's double from last year. What?
We will, once they give us the block level data, but we just know what the gross number is right now. This is Day of Reckoning, New Jersey, Illinois, California. They seem to be the poster children. You could pick Alabama, you could pick Texas. Texas doesn't have income tax, but they have really high property taxes. Well, imagine if property values stagnate and you're in Texas, then how do you make up for the lack of revenue? Their deficit is somewhere between $25 and $30 billion. It doesn't matter what state you're in or what your tax vehicle is to raise money, they're all in about the same spot. The state of Kansas, by the way, ended...
By now, just about everyone in the country is aware of the federal deficit problem.
The state of Kansas ended the 2010 fiscal year with $859 in the bank, if you want to know what their general fund was. We ended 2010 with $1.2 million. We're much smaller than the state of Kansas.
And the 550 million now they
There
have
is
to
another
make.
financial crisis looming involving state and local governments. It's gotten much less attention because each state has a slightly different story. But in the 2 years since the Great Recession wrecked their economies and shriveled their income, the states have collectively spent nearly $500 billion more than they collected in taxes, and there is $1 trillion hole in their public pension funds. The states have been getting by on billions of dollars in federal stimulus funds, but the day of reckoning is at hand. The debt crisis is already making Wall Street nervous, and some believe that it could derail the recovery, cost 1 million public employees their jobs, and require another big bailout package that no one in Washington wants to talk about.
So that's sort of the summary of the state. Governor Brownback was in town and he did an event last Friday in which he shared sort of the state of Kansas budget in terms of where we're at and where we're headed. The thing that he pointed out is that in the case of states' requirements to make Medicaid payments, there's been a 35% increase in Medicaid payments required by the state. In order to do that, they've actually borrowed money from KDOT in order to make Medicaid payments in the current year. That won't be there next year. The deficit that we're facing is somewhere between 500 to 550 million at the state of Kansas. And had we not passed a 1-cent sales tax last year, we would have been close to $1 billion in terms of what deficit was before Kansas. 56% of Kansas's budget is for education. It means that if they are going, if you heard Governor Christie from New Jersey said, you know, that third rail is K through 12 education, which nobody's ever touched before. And in New Jersey, they're touching it. In Rhode Island, Providence sent out termination notices to all their teachers. You can't fix the state budget without reducing the funding of education. If you reduce the funding of education, the only source that a local school district has here in Kansas is property tax. You saw what's happening with property values, so the question is, how big of a lug does that put onto property in terms of how do they make up their deficit? Will people accept larger classrooms? Will people accept fewer programs and special programs in school? Will people accept fewer schools? And all those things are going to play out in a really short amount of time. I think this was December 18th, 2010, so this is about 3 months old. And I don't think what people appreciate is how quickly these changes have to be made, because there is not a source of revenue or borrowing that the state of Kansas can use. They could do the Arizona trick, you know, sell the Capitol, sell the Supreme Court building, sell any public buildings, then lease them back over time. But it won't fix their structural problem, which is there's not enough money to pay for all of the services that they want to provide. As it relates to local government, it's a discussion that we've had amongst our staff. You know, we put together legislative policies that say, you know, protect, you know, special highway money, protect alcohol money. The truth is all that money has to go away in order for the state to even come close to balancing the budget, which means, you know, one of the things that we contemplated as we looked at a transportation utility fee or some way to pay for roads is that our special highway, in which we collected $300,000 from the state of Kansas, was going to go away. It might be here another year, it might be here another 6 months, but it goes away. That structural imbalance, you have to get it under control. So you have to find $500 million, and then you have to make an assumption that over time things are going to get better, because $500 million might not be enough in terms of some of the other liabilities that you're carrying, because what's happening is maintenance is getting deferred. All of a sudden, if you're siphoning money from KDOT to make Medicaid payments, that means there are roads that aren't being overlaid, they're not being sealed,
They're not safe.
and in time, they're not taken care of. What's interesting, before all of this happened, there were studies being done by the American Public Works Association as it related to infrastructure conditions in the United States. And if you remember, maybe a year ago, Justin and Matt Maldonado, both who were, Justin worked for us and Matt's a KU MPA student. He now works for the city of El Paso, I believe, which is his hometown. They did sort of, you know, street maintenance, what does it look like, what's the grade. And there's kind of a 2-minute clip that they did that was fairly effective, which talks about another megatrend that I'm going to tell you, which is infrastructure. The first megatrend is property and property values, or asset values. They're not going to go up. That bubble that burst is still bursting, by the way. My guess is it continues a while longer. There's another video that was done by the analyst who said, and this would have been spring of 2010, they asked him if this was a baseball game, what inning are we in? He said maybe the 5th or 6th, or 7th, 8th, 9th inning to come. And so there's more innings to come as it relates to property values and asset values. Yes, John?
That's infrastructure you're talking about for Kansas. I don't know if that's the group that did the one or not, but 75 or 78, and I forget the exact figure, percent of the bridges in Kansas could not sustain the weight that they were originally designed for.
Correct.
Right?
Absolutely. In fact, C-SPAN last night, I was on travel in Omaha and watched C-SPAN. Department of Transportation, Ray LaHood was on there, and they were going through each congressional person and which bridges could be fixed and which bridges. New Jersey, there's 400,000 people that cross a bridge every day.
Right.
They can't fix it.
Right. And that infrastructure issue, just like the states wouldn't address the pension fund, infrastructure hasn't been addressed by states for a long time. And there's these implicit assumptions that this growth in assets would just carry us forever, when everybody kept saying there's a bubble, this eventually bursts. And this day of reckoning is going to come a lot faster to states than I think they realize. I think Governor Christie's in the middle of the battle, California, and the question is the federal government going to bail out the states? And I don't see how they can. They can barely afford their type of government, which requires a lot of debt in order to operate it. So here's a nice sort of, Matt and Justin did a really good job on this. I think they got an A on this, by the way. And it talks a little bit about the streets and street maintenance.
Despite what your intuition may tell you, it is actually much cheaper to invest in preventative street maintenance on a regularly scheduled basis than to pay a large sum of money for total reconstruction labor. This seems relatively easy to comprehend, yet street budgets are being cut all over the country. Why? No council wants to raise taxes.
As the budgets for cities, counties, states shrank, they stopped investing in infrastructure in order to bail out their operations. As you bail out your operations, that list of projects that you're supposed to be doing in order to maintain only gets longer. I saw it on the Prairie Village Post, which is an online publication, where the city of Prairie Village estimates that their 10-year street program should be $48.6 million, and that they're underfunding their streets at a tune of $3 million a year. Overland Park is more than 125 miles behind on their street maintenance program. If you want to convert that into dollars, it's probably somewhere between 75 and 100 million. And what happens is, as you're trying to make your operating budget work by not putting anything into your infrastructure only gets worse and gets more expensive to maintain. The one statistic that I think that surprises people, because I get to talk about property taxes a lot, 3 out of every $4 that we collect through the property tax system, whether it's transportation, utility fee, or stormwater, or our general mill, go to infrastructure. So 3/4 of what we collect in terms of property tax revenues, whether it's called a fee or a tax, goes to infrastructure. Long ago, you said how important infrastructure was. And as we've built our budget and as we've looked at property taxes, we've used property tax to invest in our infrastructure. We continue to do that. We continue to find ways to leverage. I think the one thing that we have to get ready for is programs like CARS will probably go away. Those sources that we were able to leverage to get additional dollars, as the state gets in, trying to figure out that funding mechanism, that CARS money actually comes from motor fuel, which goes to the county and then it's redistributed. That too goes away. And so collectively, we're going to have to look at, how do you maintain the system that we built. In Johnson County, Martin and I have spent probably 2 years fighting at the regional level and telling people to not continue to build capacity in all of the streets in Johnson County when there isn't a property tax source or a revenue source that can sustain the payment or the maintenance of this. And so while the county commissioners might extend sewer lines, you then extend roads. How do you pay for it in the long term? As we built bigger houses on bigger lots, that's fewer houses contributing on a per acre basis to pay for infrastructure. We can afford it because we have more houses per acre than you do at 135th and Mission Road. But at 135th and Mission Road, what does it look like in 10 years? Well, my guess is it gets really hard to fund a lot of this simply because there's just so little revenue that's left. So infrastructure, property tax values, how it affects consumption and sales tax. Sales tax goes down when people can't, in a sense, borrow against their home to buy or get a home equity line to put a new roof on or to put new windows in. Tax credits that were available went away 12/31, which were really valuable, I think, in terms of energy efficiency for homes. All these things build. And there's something else that's building out there much faster than we appreciate or understand. And this is sort of my last little clip. We talk about globalization, but we don't talk really about what that means. And what it means is China. And there's such a misunderstanding in our own country about the growth of China and what that means to us. And there's such a misunderstanding of how fast that growth is occurring. In the spring of 2010, China increased their consumption of gasoline at a rate of 10. They purchased 10 times as much gasoline in the spring of 2010 than they did in the spring of 2009. Now, currently that doesn't have a real effect, but let me show you this one. There's a group called TED TV, and they have all kinds of videos, but this is a fairly good one. It's about 3.5, 4 minutes.
Changing with really remarkable
Like
speed.
France or Great Britain or the United States or Canada, it's a civilization state that's been developed over 3,000 years. So their approach, those things that they hold valuable to them are their civilization. It's not, while we might think they're a global competitor, they're very myopic in terms of what their interests are. And their interests are in their own civilization. And so he goes on to, for 20 minutes, if you want to see, it's kind of interesting when talking about how a civilization state is much different than a nation state, and it's much different in the way it behaves with the rest of the world, because it doesn't view the rest of the world as important to its civilization. This becomes important Because if their economy goes past ours by 2020, that means their consumption of gasoline is equivalent to ours. If that is the case, if they continue to build roads at the pace that they are, and bridges, and they continue to expand their middle class, and remember, they're expanding a middle class of 700 to 800 million people, twice the population of the United States. I mean, some of the statistics that we need to understand is that in the next 10 years, China will graduate more college students, both at the bachelor and graduate level from their universities, than we will have done in the previous 50 years. That they are building a very educated society that can compete. And they don't really have to compete with anybody but themselves once they become the largest and really the economy that dominates the world. The other thing that he goes on to talk about is that over the last 10 years, the Chinese have, in a sense, given the United States $1.4 trillion by reducing their standard of living and borrowing and giving us money. And that as they start to surpass us, they really don't need our economy in order to survive. And if you then take his premise that they're a civilization state, not a nation state, a civilization state that believes in their civilization and the growth of their civilization, you kind of see why they've been remote from the rest of the world for the last 3,000 years. And they continue to be. And so I will tell you that this globalization trend is really a discussion about China. By the way, you can go back to Megatrends that Naisbitt wrote in the late 1880s, and he talks about the growth of China, the paper tigers of the Far East and how they were going to come on. China has come on at a rate much faster than he even predicted in terms of how they're building things. They will have 10 megacities. A megacity is like a New York City. They will have 10 megacities every decade for the next 20, 30 years. They will build 10 more megacities. It's mostly being built in eastern China, by the way. They don't have that many resources. They sign long-term contracts with Venezuela. Venezuela provides them with most of their oil. And they just go out and buy entire countries' natural resources. They have the capital to do it. Here's the one that I always like. How many billionaires were there in China in 1990? And the answer is 0. How many billionaires are there in China today? 100. I mean, it's shocking how quickly they have grown as an economy and how dominating they are on the world stage.
But one area they can't grow in, and that's space. So what do they do with space?
They live in smaller apartments in smaller places, and density doesn't bother them. They don't spread out like the United States does. So as you look at these megatrends, and I want to come back to them, it's infrastructure, it's this property or asset value bubble that still hasn't burst all the way. It's how do you fund all these levels of government when you have this declining source of revenue. It's that you have a global competitor that for the most part, there's nothing that prohibits China coming in right now and taking all of this foreclosed property and just start bundling it together and becoming one of the largest landowners in the United States.
All they have to do is call in their IOUs and say we want something for them.
So as you start looking at how you grapple with the budget, you also have to understand that you have a major world competitor. My guess is if I took everything in this room, 85% of it's made in China or made by a China corporation. It's more than we would ever realize. John's familiar with it because I want to say 3 years ago when we were in Senator Roberts' office, we were talking about a plane where most of the component parts were made in China. And it was for the U.S. Air Force, I think.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, if at some point we won't have any industrial base, it will all been moved offshore. The service base only works so long as you have the capital and capacity. There's other demographic trends that are happening. We're aging, we're graying as a country. We look more like France or Greece in terms of population than we do in Egypt or Libya, where 65% of the population is under 30. In the case of China, if they're growing their population at 10% a year, 1.3 billion, how many people did they add in a decade? That's 130 million. They add the United States every 25 years, the size of the United States in population.
They have a limit on children,
Uh-huh.
so like one child per family.
Rooms, they have
So-
limits on everything.
So as I start working on this forecast, my hope tonight was to just point out all these, what I call these mega trends that are out here that you have to start making our budgets fit inside of. And some of these, some of them are fairly simple to solve, but there's a lot more debate that's going to have to happen in terms of how government services are delivered. I mean, we're really one of the first cities that went to Johnson County and said, you have an IT department, we don't. Why don't we figure out how we can use your IT department to be ours? And my guess is once our interlocal gets done, you're going to see sort of what I call the domino effect of everybody starting to look at their back office operations and say, well, why do we do IT? It's sort of like why we use Johnson County to do our building inspection. I mean, it makes sense if they have the capacity to use them. It's being paid for by the taxpayers, and if we can collect and pay for their service and make a little money for the city and it didn't cost us anything, those are the things that we need to look at collectively. And there's more of those out there that we need to investigate. So as we go forward, and by the way, I asked the staff this morning, we went around the room, I said, if I were to say, what are the big trends in local government that we need to be concerned about? Everything that I talked about tonight, they brought up. These aren't new things, these aren't new to you. I will tell you, we've been able to do really well in that we diversified our revenues. If you remember, in 0304, we increased our franchise fees so we weren't so dependent on sales tax. We diversified sort of the things that we were paying for. We made a big bet that infrastructure was going to be important if you wanted to redevelop the community. And some of that is starting to pay off. And so I think as we go forward, we have to be mindful of those things that are out there that we're going to have to accommodate. Our budget has to accommodate the fact that the state of Kansas in 2 years is going to take $400,000 from us.
And they're not going to give any of it back.
And it will never come back.
It will not come back.
And it will go out of the budget
deposits.
and it will be gone. And then the question is, then you have to kind of wrestle with, are we going to support those people that do alcohol abuse and alcohol abuse education? Are we going to step into that void? Or do we leave it to you other not-for-profits? Because you have to start making choices as to how you spend your money. And I've had arguments with other city managers when we talk about smaller government, and they get mad at me because they say, well, you're always for smaller government. I said, smaller doesn't mean that we're not better, and smaller doesn't mean that we don't make strategic investments. Smaller is a recognition that there's fewer resources available to us. And the quicker that we understand that, and the quicker that we accommodate what those restraints and constraints are, the quicker you can start identifying what are the things that we want to invest in as a community. And you stop talking about, the size of the budget, because the budget is always going to be shrinking, I think, for the next 4 to 5 years. It's just the way it's going to be.
Except for capers, we'll have to pay more.
Well, employees should have been paying more.
Well, they should have, but you know that in the recession bill, they have 83.5 million coming out of capers to balance the budget.
Yeah, and so yet another problem. By fixing one, we exacerbate another one. And so you have to stop it. You have to start kind of picking what you're going to invest in. That's all I had, and Missouri plays at 8:30.